Just last week at the US, professional swimmer, now turned women's activist Riley Gaines, was ambushed at a speaking event in San Francisco, bombarded and attacked on her way in, with Riley eventually forced to barricade herself in a classroom for over 3 hours in fear of her safety. So what sparked the violence, you asked? Well, nothing more than Gaines, a former champion swimmer, urging fairness in women's sport and for biological men to be kept out of female competition. We saw too the reaction to comments from Victorian MP Moira Deeming, who's spoken out of being raped as a child as a motivation for her to campaign for safe spaces for women. Deeming's now copped a 9-month suspension, with thousands of Liberal supporters demanding that is overturned. Now, after a century of fighting for women's rights, it seems we've arrived at a position where these rights are being eroded all over again. I'm pleased to say joining me now is women's rights activist and Associate Professor in Political Philosophy at the University of Melbourne, Holly Lawford-Smith. Professor Holly, welcome to the program. Great to have you. This has become such a big issue. I know and you know better than anyone. I mean, it's been building for a while, but it seems just to have exploded. So how have we got to the position where after decades, centuries really, of fighting for our rights, and let's not forget women in this country have only had the vote for about a century, it feels like everything's being wound back. You know, single-sex spaces, all the changes, we're losing gender in our language, fairness in sport. How have we got to this?
Yep. Look, I think there's been this lie that has been told over and over and over again so many times that people have started to believe it, and that is that to care about female people as a constituency, half the population of the whole world, to be a feminist in the original sense, is somehow anti-trans, is hateful, is bigoted, is evil, I think was the word that Dan Andrews used, right? And I think maybe the reason people have swallowed this lie rather than seeing it for the absolute absurdity that it is that we have this trans activist movement kind of masquerading as just any other kind of human rights, social justice movement, when it isn't. It's an extraordinarily controversial and pseudoscientific ideology.
So what are the human rights that trans Australians don't have? I mean, I can't see what they're arguing for, and in fact what they are pushing for is entry into spaces that have been hard-fought women's spaces. So it's a diminution of loss of women's rights. But I can't see, I mean, look at all the anti-discrimination law in this country, look at the Human Rights Commission. I can't see what their grievance is.
Exactly right. So what they would be doing if it was just your ordinary type of social justice movement would be arguing for transgender people's rights as a group. That would be trans women, trans men, non-binary people, and they would be focusing on things like anti-discrimination legislation. So there's no discrimination against a trans woman in employment, for example, but they're not. They're pushing for trans women to have women's rights. This is a conflict of interest between two marginalized / minority groups, where trans women want women's rights, the right to enter women-only spaces, the right to make women-specific language gender neutral to accommodate them. It's really like people just, I think, don't see the extent to which this is a kind of conflict of interest between two minorities rather than just a social inclusion project.
It's also not going after men. We're not talking about trans men, so biological women turned men, taking away men's rights, men's spaces, men's language. I'm not seeing many cases of them turning up in men's prisons. The real assault, the real target here is women's rights.
I think that's right. The only conflict that I've seen being caused with trans men is again between two minority groups. So there's some issues arising between gay men and trans men. So female people wanting to have access to things like gay saunas and for gay men to be willing to date them. But the issue is never kind of like up against the dominant members of society. And maybe that's because they know it wouldn't fly with them, right? So it's the other minority groups that are sort of expected from their historical struggles to make space or to give in more easily. I'm not sure.
You teach at a university campus. I'll declare that was my old university. I mean, how are these issues playing out in the world of academia? And you mentioned before pseudoscience. I mean, take climate change. We're told to respect the science, that the science is clear. The last time I went to school, biology was pretty clear too.
Right. It really depends so much from university to university. So I have a sort of honorary position with the University of Reading in the UK. They've been really fantastic. So I gave a talk there maybe about a year ago on conversion therapy legislation. There was a big outcry, as usual, from the students. There was some local media, some protesting. The Vice-Chancellor simply watched my talk, and then he put out a statement really just reaffirming the university's commitment to academic freedom and saying this was all fully within the bounds of ordinary research. So that's a great response, right? But some universities are very much kind of co-opted by diversity and inclusion, like going that route instead of kind of sticking to their core business of knowledge production and protecting academic freedom. So it really depends on the university.
I mean, the funniest thing is, you know, it's not funny even, it's not funny in that sense, but 30 years ago when I was at Melbourne University, Sheila Jeffries taught a subject, a feminist subject called sexual politics. I was one of her students. I did feminist legal theory. I did a lot of hardcore feminist subjects. Most people watching this show would think, God, Peter Credlin, what were you doing there? But I wanted to understand the whole debate and the things, Holly, that we were debating and fighting for women that had yet to be won, even as only 30 years ago. We've won them and now we're losing them again. I still can't fathom why women are letting this happen in our time, in our name, right across the country.
Look, I think it's just, it's a difficult thing for people to get their heads around, right? Because at first it looks like you're not giving anything away. It looks like you can have, you know, women-centered language and single-sex spaces. You're just letting a few more people into them. Like really vulnerable trans women, they can come in too. So you've got your female stuff and you've just like shared the good around a little further. I think it's really hard for people to understand that that's not true. As soon as you give single-sex spaces away to some males, you don't have single-sex spaces anymore. So I think there's like, it's hard to get the issues across in the sense of what's actually at stake here.
Melbourne University Professor there, Holly Lawford-Smith. Thank you for your time. I think you and I are going to speak a little more often. Appreciate it.